Hello and welcome to Unpublished TV. I'm Ed Hand. UTV is the newest production from Unpublished Media. This weekly live panel discussion completes our set of 4 internet properties created to help you influence and impact public policy decision-making in Canada. They're Unpublished.vote.com, the Unpublished Cafe podcast, which I also host, and Unpublished.vote. Now, each week we'll introduce a new topic through the Unpublished Cafe podcast and Unpublished.vote, where you will find the podcast and background information from a variety of sources to help further inform before you cast your vote, and email your MP to tell them why you think what you do. Then every Monday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, we'll reconvene here on UTV to examine how the issues evolved and how you, our audience, reacted to our poll question. We want your input as well. You can send us comments or questions through Facebook or YouTube. Now, has there been an industry more impacted by the COVID pandemic than the airline industry? Tens of thousands of jobs slashed as Canadians stayed home instead of traveling. When the lockdown began, demand for air travel dropped in some cases by 90%. Now, slowly the industry is moving forward, but it will look different to anyone who hasn't been in an airport in the last few months. Only staff and passengers are allowed inside now. Distancing measures are in place, as are temperature checks and face masks. Our Unpublished.vote question was, would you feel comfortable taking a flight in Canada right now? And joining us to talk about that are 3 guests. Professor Carl Moore is an expert on the airline industry and associate professor at the Desautels Faculty of Management at McGill University. Gabor Lukács is the president and founder of Air Passenger Rights, and Anthony Noreyko is the president and CEO of the Canadian Business Aviation Association. And I thank all 3 of you for joining us. I'll just tell you our numbers about our question, which was, do you feel comfortable flying in Canada today? And 67.9% said no, just over 31% said yes. And Gabor, we'll start with you first. Does that surprise you or no?
It doesn't surprise me at all. There was actually a survey by Ledger that found that 72% of Canadians are not comfortable overall. So actually, probably it's a very low number compared to what was measured just a couple of days ago.
Carl, are you surprised by those numbers?
No, not really. I flew last week, and so I had a personal experience maybe I can share with you later on.
Mm-hmm.
It was really relatively empty Montreal and Toronto airports. I grew up in Toronto, lived in Montreal now for 20 years. They were not quite ghost towns, but not far from it. So absolutely numbers are down. But on the other hand, I've read reports of people being jammed together and the middle seat being sold. I watched something on the Wall Street Journal where one of their reporters went from London to Madrid, and absolutely chock-a-block plane. So I'm not surprised that Canadians would be concerned given what we've gone through in the last couple of months of lockdown.
What about you, Anthony? You're in the industry. Are you surprised that more than 2/3 feel that way?
Well, look, I think everything that we've become accustomed to with commercial aviation has changed, from the airport experience, the check-in procedure, the airlines, the waiting, the boarding, et cetera. And, from our perspective from business aviation, when we think about our primary mission is safe, reliable, and efficient transportation. When you think of safety now, you get the ability to control who you're sitting with, which is an obvious concern on the commercial flights. In terms of reliability, think to what our nation's carriers have had to, what actions they've undertaken to limit service into more rural areas of the country. Last, efficiency. You've got now the choice with the tool that you select to effectively price the solution that you need. So the time cost benefit returns that often our sector looks at, or even just the traveling public, as costs go up because the airlines need to cover these increased costs, it's going to be passed on. So it's certainly not a surprise, but I think there's a path, and I'm looking forward to the discussion about the way forward, what we can do to responsibly travel again.
Well, you've written a letter to the Minister of Transport and calling on the business aviation industry to lead the economic recovery. How do you see that happening?
Well, I think if you look at, a favorite expression of mine is you can lead, you can follow, or you can get out of the way. And I think primarily the issue to contend with first is our provincial and federal leaders need to come together to understand that we can't travel about in our own country. We talked about controlling the spread. When you look now at some of the restrictions, for instance, if you live in Ontario, you want to go to, let's say, Nova Scotia, the Atlantic bubble is in effect, 14-day quarantine. If you live in Ontario and you want to go to Manitoba, well, only if you live in the northwest corner of Ontario are you able to travel to Manitoba without quarantine. So the first recognition is, if we have, as a country, have come together to fight this epidemic. And now that we start to see the success, I mean, as we know in Ontario, we're now in stage 3, the measures that the Quebec government has undertaken. As all of this has changed, we need to recognize that domestic is the opportunity. Second, I think, is the EU, the international components. When you look at where some of the countries in the EU with respect to reciprocity and the wins that they've had with COVID and how they're trying to recognize Canadian travelers, I think that's an opportunity. And certainly we're going to talk about, with all of our international measures, it's all about test, test, test. And I think there's a fantastic discussion to be had. A favorite, he's an assistant prof at Harvard in epidemiology, but Michael Mina, he talks about 2 things. One, lowering the costs of testing. Really, it's sort of like, I guess the best way to describe it would be like those paper tests if you go in a pool or a jacuzzi, doing a COVID test to do it basically every day, as opposed to these PCR tests that we do now, which include lab times, high costs, et cetera. So for us, the solution certainly has to revolve around using responsible testing, making it more affordable, deploying the technology that's available so that we can jumpstart and keep Canadian business moving. And so that's really, in a nutshell, the approach that we've taken.
Yeah, Carl, Anthony brings up an interesting point that, you've got obviously aviation. This is a big country, it's federal. And then we've got our 10 provinces all spread out and all with different rules. So you've got an industry that's got to jump through all these hoops. And at the same time, they are still looking for help from the government. They kind of have nowhere to go right now, do they?
It's brutal. It is the worst it's been in aviation history. I talked to Tony Tyler, the head of Cathay Pacific and then IATA last week for my radio show. And Tony was just saying he's never seen anything remotely like this. They're down 95%. It's like a ghost town the last few weeks when I was out at Montreal Trudeau Airport Saturday morning. So they're in deep trouble as an industry. And we see the EU has provided help, the US, some of the airlines have got help from Asia and so on. So the question is, what is the help that the Canadian government, Ottawa, should give to the airline industry? And Air Canada canceled some flights to smaller towns, which I lived in Regina for a while when I worked for IBM. That really hurts. I think part of that was put a little bit of political pressure through the mayors and through the premiers on Ottawa to get to it and provide some support for this industry. Now, as Canada, we're the second largest country in the world. We're spread out very close to the US border. We can't take the train easily from Montreal to Vancouver. It just goes on forever, or driving. So we need it from a viewpoint of business. We need it from a viewpoint of families. We also need it from a viewpoint of tourism as a huge industry. So this is a huge economic hit for Canada. On the other hand, of course, we've got to care about safety. And it's interesting, I was reading a report in the FT that one of the analysts pointed out that the airlines are now competing on safety, which has never happened before. Because you go, above all, get the people there safely. Part of it was our pilots and our flight attendants are on the plane. Like, we have skin in the game.
Yeah.
This is a personal thing of our Air Canada or WestJet or whoever family. So get there safely. That is a bit in play now, and that is something that makes us nervous. But a vaccine will solve it. Business jets are great if you can afford that sort of thing. And it's how do we get to that where the economics would work out a bit, not to be profitable, but merely to survive, and safety. There's enormous tension between those two right now, I feel.
We've got a question coming in on Facebook Live. And is there a potential for Canadian carriers to merge here? What do you think, Carl?
No. Not the bigger play. Like, we only have
two.
Air Canada and WestJet, Porter, which is pretty small and flies Q400s out of Toronto Island Airport, essentially. So it's really, if they merge, it's called a monopoly, largely, and that will not work in Canada. Now, we have U.S. airlines flying when they're allowed into Canada. We have BA coming over, Lufthansa, which is part of a partner of Air Canada, but we can't have just one airline of any substantial size. We need competition in this country. Remember when Air Canada, I don't know if you're old enough to remember this, was Air Canada combined with Canadian.
Yep.
And that caused some real problems. We need at least two strong competitors, albeit we do have some competitors flying into the country. So I think them combining is a really dumb idea.
What about Air Transit? You didn't mention Air Transit when the issue with merger with Air Canada.
Well, I would assume they'll be part of Air Canada, but in one way, I think you're agreeing with me, oddly enough, Gabor, that it just makes it worse when those two combine.
Certainly, I have misgivings even about that merger, and I think the European regulator are also not happy with it. Although it seems that currently Air Canada is trying to look for an excuse not to go through with the merger because it will not necessarily be economic for them now.
Well, the M&A, why did you do that merger? The underlying reasons have certainly evolved, to put it kindly.
Mhm.
And does it make sense anymore is a question that we have on the table, I think. But the airline industry is just so important to this country. We can't have a monopoly. And again, remember, Air Canada was a long time ago owned by the government. Again, some people said, why doesn't the government take it over? You go, again, a dumb idea, because government's great at some things, business is good at others.
Yeah.
But government running a business doesn't seem to work well. We learned that under Margaret Thatcher and various other people over the time. They're great at different things. Let them do the thing they're good at.
But what about the German model? We have seen that Angela Merkel, who is far from being a socialist or communist, still agreed to Germany taking a minority position in Lufthansa in exchange for a bailout.
Well, a minority position is different than being owned by the government. Like Air Canada was a crown corporation way back when. So something, our BA was owned by the government. And so there's things when they used to be part of the government. So some people have suggested that some kind of ownership position is a possibility. And I think limiting executive salaries, not doing stock buybacks, servicing small cities, there's some things I think the government should press Air Canada and WestJet on.
But don't you think that the government has effectively decided not to force airlines to provide passengers with refunds as a way of providing an implicit payout at the public expense?
Now, Ed, if I can answer Gabor directly.
Sure.
So one is bailout is an emotional word. Gabor, you're an emotional guy, but that's a word which is, it's different. Well, it's different than economic help is less emotional than bailout, but we'll leave that there.
Okay.
And I agree that it's partly the airlines in such deep, profound trouble. To refund just gets us deeper in the hole. And in some cases, we say, let's give them a couple of years and they can travel again. But yet I have an elderly person who's not going to travel in a couple of years. So some of those cases are ones which I think they have more of a leg to stand on, and Air Canada, WestJet should help them. But it's something where they're just profound trouble laying off 20,000 people. It's something we have to realize these are unique, utterly different circumstances.
So, yeah. Carl, do you believe that just because I need food, I can go to my neighbor's house, take out something from their fridge and have it, or take their car? I mean, don't you feel that?
I hear someone in the kitchen. Gabor, I close the fridge. Yeah. So no, obviously not. But it's there's a tension there. But I think that they're in such deep trouble that there's wiggle room within the act to allow the government to allow that there. But on the other hand, I agree that there's some cases where it's tough.
Doesn't matter. Do you think rule of law doesn't matter? And do you think even if we, so there's one part which is the question of rule of law. The law is, it's provincial law, federal law has always been that if you don't provide a service, you have to pay it back. That has been for the past 16 years of jurisprudence. It's set out in Ontario Consumer Protection Act, Quebec Consumer Protection Act. In fact, the Quebec Legislative Assembly passed a motion calling on the federal government to simply respect Quebec's laws in dealing with this matter. Now, do you think that those things we should just say because those are special times, the laws don't matter, and large corporations, they're too big to fall? That's question number one. Question number two is, with this kind of attitude, do you think anybody is going to buy tickets when things are recovering, which I hope eventually they will recover, given that there are other airlines which are providing refunds, such as south of the border or the European airlines to some degree? How is it actually helping the industry? I'm quite struggling to see that from a purely industrial perspective. Forget about passengers, just the airline's own self-interest. If you treat consumers this way, if the first thing that people think when they say Air Canada is, oh, that's the company that stole the passengers' money, who is going to buy tickets?
I think it's Anthony has a comment.
Well, I was just going to add that, it's important to recognize, of course, that sure, we're talking about the commercial airline challenges, but if you think of the air industry, Carl, you've mentioned the importance of aviation and its tie to travel and tourism, but think broadly about the entire industry. So think first to the airports, think first to our air traffic control agencies, our, look at Bombardier now, the only thing they make is business aircraft, CAE, Pratt & Whitney, the number of companies and entities and Canadians that are supported across the breadth of the industry. So it's certainly important to think about how the average Canadian chooses to travel, which is by commercial travel. But it's also important to recognize the devastation that all of those ancillary players, those vital players, the role that they have, and that now with COVID, the impact that they're all undertaking. So it's quite dramatic. So it's true, Gabor. The concerns of the flying public need to be addressed, and I think you highlighted it the right way, which is to say it's a bit of a bailout of a different kind. Instead of paying taxpayer dollars, the government is doing what they're doing. But I think it's important to recognize there's a whole other pile here that needs to be addressed for the health of the aviation industry in Canada and its importance that it plays across the country.
Okay, well, what needs to be addressed,
are you
Anthony? Hang on for a second, or let's get back to Anthony here for a sec. What needs to be addressed?
Well, I think if you look at, let's say first, NAV Canada. NAV Canada is planning, they're the air traffic control agency that looks after not only just Canadian airspace, but basically the bulk of the north, the polar routes, and the Atlantic getting across to Europe. And there are proposed fee increases that are being planned both for domestic and for Atlantic travel. Now they're trying to do a fair job, if you will, of spreading this out over 5 years, but it's an additional burden placed on the airlines. These are costs that will be passed on to the commercial traveler, like everything else that will come when commercial does everything. Your baggage fees, your meals, all that's going to go up to account for the costs they've incurred. Airports, I mean, look at the GTAA. They're laying off 500 people. Traffic, when it's ludicrous to hear that traffic at an airport has fallen, say 92, 95%. I mean, you can't imagine. I mean, a room of 100 people, 95 of them walk out. That's what's left. I mean, sometimes you got to put it in that perspective, but there is some devastation out there, and we're not done. And certainly the conversation centers often around AC and WestJet, but there is a whole industry out there of people that are hurting right now, and we are not done.
So we are talking here still about a few tens of thousands of people, maybe 100,000 people, which is certainly there has to be some help provided to those individual workers. No, I'll be the first person to admit it and to support it. But the question is, what about those between 1 and 2 million passengers who are currently owed refunds that have not been paid, and that those airlines are breaking the law in so doing? Does it justify it from a commercial, from a legal, from a policy perspective to say that in some situations the laws actually don't apply without actually Parliament passing a law, without a court saying that they don't apply? So you see, for example, in the case of a restructuring, CCAA, there are proper procedures for renegotiating contracts, for saying, okay, you owe this money, but actually this company is in trouble, they don't have to pay. There are proper procedures for it in democracy. Why are we not using those? Why are we not dealing with those matters, which I agree with you, there are some very serious questions here, but why are we not doing them with the proper procedures, with the proper channels?
Carl?
I'm not a lawyer, so I can't answer the legal side of that.
Sure.
But I think, see, to me, the bigger issue is what Anthony's been talking about is how do we get people safely back on planes? Because if they're on planes, they're flying, and Air Canada, WestJet, and Porter are starting to make money, maybe there'd be some finances to help deal with your issue, Gabor. So I think the bigger thing is how do we get people comfortably on the planes? IATA and ICAO have talked to some leading medical experts at the Mayo Clinic, at the WHO, and so on. And there seems to be some sense of arguments that it's safe to be there because of the HEPA filters, because of the air, everybody wearing masks, as they did on my flights last week. The interesting part is they're doing this in various parts of the world, so we're starting to get data. So in theory, it's safe, but it's interesting. We're starting to get lots of data where we can look at, not you and I are not competent, but they're competent people can look at it and say, how safe is it from a data viewpoint? And I think we've already been weeks into this, where that's something which hopefully will come out soon and say, we've looked at the data and the risk is very small indeed. Now, if
so far, I'm sure you're aware of the MIT study that was published a couple of weeks ago. What that concluded is that eliminating the physical distancing on board nearly doubles the risk of flying. It doesn't mean that necessarily you're going to die if you get COVID-19. I think that there's been some misunderstanding there. When you look at the risk of getting infected and dying as a result, it would still be a relatively low risk.
So, Gabor, would you like to be no flights and all the airlines bankrupt because they're paying off people? Like, is that what you're suggesting we adopt as a country?
I'm suggesting that the rest of the 97% of the economy, which are not airlines, should not be put at risk with possibly a second wave in order to ensure that airlines remain viable. I don't think that airlines would necessarily go bankrupt. Moreover, when you look at the actual infrastructure, the pilots are there, the crew are there, the aircrafts are there. They're not going to go, they're not going to disappear. So the people who may be hurting are shareholders primarily. They may be taking a haircut through some kind of CCAA process. And you're using big words. You're talking about bankruptcy, but in reality, what we could see is a restructuring process. And that I would actually be the first person to argue that it's actually necessary to protect the airlines. Currently, the airlines are locked into long-term leases that were signed on the basis of profit levels and revenue levels from travel, which cannot be realized with the current level of travel with an aircraft. So airlines are now locked in contracts that are completely unrealistic. And a CCA process would be one way where a judge could say, this contract is very nice, but it wasn't made now. It was made when you could fly an aircraft 12, 14, 16 hours a day. So I'm ordering that this contract be modified as such, and the judge can approve it. That would be something, that would be a solution where actually the commercial players would take a reasonable amount of risk and consequences of the situation, not the traveling public who are not investors, not creditors, but average consumers.
I think it's important, you take a page from the first principles thinking, focus on what is right versus who is right. And I think this is definitely part of a conversation that needs to happen. But if you go to the base, what is the problem we're trying to solve here? The problem with COVID is that because we don't have a robust testing regime, I don't hear anybody talking about group testing on aircraft. In other words, you scan a whole aircraft and you say, okay, everybody provides their test upon landing. Let's say with international flights, our US counterparts, trade with the US is so critical. We're not talking about testing. We still have the ban in place. You think of when I mentioned that Michael Mina, the idea of low cost daily testing, only in the fringes are those PCR tests, the nasal swabs that everybody sees the images of. Those are expensive and take a long time to get a result. But you can do these paper tests. We can push that through. We can encourage, and this is why, Ed, you made the reference to why we've brought the business aviation realm to the front, is because we are smaller, we're more unique. We don't have people gathering at a terminal, let's say. Our fixed-based operators, most people can walk from their parked vehicle straight to the aircraft. When they come into the FBO, if they're going to go through, it's at a new level because of not only just the requirements, but because of the desire for that business to be at the higher standard. So when you go to that first principle, we need to solve this question of testing. Right now, if we can do a simple daily test, we do away with what's the risk here? Right now, the risk is that we allow people to just travel around and we only test them after they feel symptoms. And so I think we need to push the government on the testing. And if they can't answer these questions effectively, this is why I even brought up what we said, lead, follow, or get out of the way. Let's push them to encourage this new wave of testing, because these will solve, Gabor, the challenges that you're bringing up. If we can bring people a sense of comfort, they'll return to flying. But it's sort of, one of the challenges is sort of take from the right pocket, put it in the left pocket. It's an assessment, a question that needs to be answered. Certainly those Canadians that haven't got that service completed, either the airline needs to extend whatever terms of flexibility they can afford, or work with the government accordingly. But in the end, every traveler is going to be unique, and either way, if the ultimate end is the taxpayer funds the obligation to the airline, I don't know that that's ideal. So nobody's winning in this situation, that's for sure.
Anthony, have you looked at, I don't know how small operations that are in your circle of work. I can tell you that when you look at Air Canada's finances, they used to owe at some point $2.6 billion with $8 to $10 billion of liquidity, of unrestricted liquidity. They had more than enough money to issue refunds to passengers. It's not a case of an airline on the brink of bankruptcy. There's simply no truth to those kind of claims with respect to Air Canada or Air Transit, for that matter, that they will go bankrupt. I very much agree with you that testing is important, and actually, not only for airlines, but everywhere, the entire economy. You shouldn't be entering a university, a school, a hospital, a library without first being tested. We are turning on the same page. But even if there were testing tomorrow, there is another risk that you seem to just brush under the carpet, which is that passengers who book a flight and then the flight is canceled for whatever reason don't seem to be getting back their hard-earned money. If you think that it's from left pocket, from right pocket, well, then perhaps your money, Anthony, would be way better in my pockets. If you think that's a valid argument. I don't think it's a valid argument. It's a very simple question that taking someone else's property doesn't belong to you is called theft. That's in a capitalism. We can have a socialist society. It would be a different society where we perhaps socialize goods, have maybe a form of guaranteed income. That's a whole different debate for a different day. But as long as we all agree that we live in capitalism, we all agree that private property is something that has to be respected, then money that provided for services not rendered have to be refunded. Why? Because the law. The airline cannot hold on to this as a non-refundable cash advance, free of interest, mind you.
Okay, Gabor. Gabor, we've been on Air Canada for a while now, and they have no friends. We know that they have a lot of issues, in particular dealing with the pandemic right now. But I want to ask you directly, because Anthony brought it up. This is all about safety. What's going to make you feel safe to get on an airplane again?
I would need to do two things. I would like to see that everybody who gets on the plane is tested. I'm very much in support of what Anthony is saying. It's a very good approach. And I would like to see financial guarantees that if for whatever reason the flight doesn't take off, then I get back my money. I would also add that I would want to have a safety guarantee that if somebody else is tested positive and they don't get on the plane because they're tested positive, they get back their money, because I don't want people to hide their illness. Currently, the situation with refunds is dangerous, not only financially, but because it creates an incentive for people out of fear to maybe take a Tylenol if they have fever, to somehow avoid showing the symptoms. At this time, the only viable solution would be slightest concerns, here's your money back, sir, get better, we'll have to fly you tomorrow.
Well, we'll see if that happens. Now, Carl, when I look at the industry and it's hoping to bounce back, we hear about a V-shaped recovery or U-shaped recovery. Which do you see right now?
I think a U, quite a long U bottom, because until we have a vaccine, I don't think people want to fly broadly. Anthony, I wish this testing you talk about existed. I don't think it does. Hopefully it will someday, but I don't think it's out there now, or it's too expensive. Because I'm flying to Reykjavik next month, all being well, and I'm going to do a COVID-19 test in Montreal, fly down to Toronto, go to Reykjavik, and I'll have a test when I get to Reykjavik. So I'll just be extremely careful in those hours in between, and hopefully it won't be a problem. So I would wish that I could know at the airport and they go, Carl, go to the hospital, you have COVID-19, which I would. And I would give it, well, I wouldn't give them a kiss because that'd be entirely inappropriate, but I'd like to hug them. If they could tell me you have the disease, go treat it, I'd go, thank you so much. So this would be great if it existed, the vaccine when it exists. But I think in the meantime, I'm going to fly to Reykjavik because I've looked at what experts say, and I feel comfortable with it. Now, I don't want to be, sitting beside someone with big shoulders like Anthony, side by side, that I would feel uncomfortable with. So I would, but my son will probably come with me, so I'll sit beside him, so we can make sure that we're, as a group,
in a bubble
a bit.
Yeah.
If it was said the whole plane is sold out, you are going to be beside someone, I might not get on the plane, and I would believe I would get a refund or saying we'll give you a credit to fly sometime in the future. So maybe I'm just too risky, maybe I'm not Canadian enough, but I'm willing to do some of those things. I did it last week and I felt comfortable doing that, but I realized that's not the average more conservative Canadian. And c'est la vie. I have to say French in public, so I hope I did that.
That's fine. Now, you had mentioned earlier when we were talking that you did do the flight from Montreal to Toronto.
Yeah, and I felt comfortable doing that. I read up on the research, talked to people at IATA, at WHO, some former students or senior people at both places, talked to them about it, got their advice. So I felt comfortable that there was relatively small risk. Oh,
sorry, Carl.
Go ahead, Anthony.
I was just going to bring into the point. So there is the technology today, and the problem is, like for instance, in the Trump White House, they had this Abbott Labs test. Michael Mina published it. It was an op-ed in the New York Times. It was July 3rd. If for those that are interested in finding it, the problem, the reason why it's not adopted yet is that the technology exists today. We can do this test. They're claiming at least for $1, basically print it on some cardboard and you can get it. The problem with the PCR is that what they're accustomed to is having the ability, the analytical accuracy to identify the virus in these samples. And so the PCR has been treated as the gold standard, that nasal swab. But what's interesting is if you take the approach of these tests can still determine whether or not you have viral load. And the question is, it may not be accurate on day one, but if you take a regime where you're doing it multiple times, so like right now, if you haven't taken a COVID test, it's better to even say if you went every other day, or, I think of school kids or getting on an aircraft, take a test every single day. And if you are positive, well, stay home. Call for the test. Isolate yourself. If you're still negative, perhaps even if in the alternative is if you've got a little bit of an accuracy error, maybe you don't catch it on day one, but you catch it on day two because the viral load is enough in your body then to trigger. So I think that it's there, and that's what I'm saying is if we can push government and science, so like what we're talking about with Health Canada and improving these things, if we can push them into those areas and saying that we all want it's yes or it's no, and sometimes we can't live with shades of gray. And I think what we need to do is to understand that we can do something with shades of gray and we can still act. And we'll be better off if we follow that path than, well, let's just do a coin flip right now. Because Ed, to your question, it's difficult. This VFR, visiting friends and relatives, is what typically Canadians do when they get on the aircraft. Sure, a portion of that is going to be business travel, and that's when businesses are going to move. This is where we've seen an uptick. But when you think of that VFR, that visiting friends and relatives, it's going to be difficult and it's going to take a while. And until we open up even domestically our provincial borders to fellow Canadians, this is going to be a challenge.
Yeah, that it will. Gentlemen, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for Unpublished TV as we discussed getting the airlines resuming again. It'll probably be a slow slog, but looking to get that moving forward. Carl Moore joining us. He's an expert on the airline industry, associate professor of the Desautels Faculty of Management at McGill University. Gabor Lukács, he is the president and founder of Air Passenger Rights. And Anthony Norieko is the president and CEO of Canadian Business Aviation Association. And thank you for joining us on Unpublished TV. Coming up next Monday, the return to school for students in September. What could possibly go wrong? Thanks for listening, and thanks for watching Unpublished TV. I'm Ed Hand.